We surveyed our audience basically asking how they feel about politics in general, and it was very grim.
Yes.
So 89% said they didn't feel inspired, and 93% said they didn't feel represented. Why do you think so many people don't feel like they belong to Australian politics?
Because it's completely detached from their everyday lives. Like, they might be struggling to pay the rent, they might be giving up on ever being able to afford a home, terrified about climate change, struggling with student debt. And then they flick on the TV and they see a political class largely completely ignoring all of those issues, either pretending like they don't exist or not doing anything meaningful to change it. And certainly when they look at either the Labor Party or Liberal Party, the sort of parties traditionally formed government, basically under them, their lives get worse every year. And so, why would you feel in any way attached to politics or inspired by it if the only decisions politicians ever make who are in power are ones that make their lives worse?
Totally. And I mean, even conversations with some of my friends, we do feel quite hopeless at times to even feel like, okay, well, we have about 20 different crises hitting us at once. I suppose, how do you suggest that we kind of push through that and get more involved and engaged in politics?
Well, firstly, it's important to note that sense of hopelessness. Politicians rely on that. And you notice this whenever the Greens say, when we come out and we say, for instance, we should freeze rents or scrap student debt or build enough housing, the government should build housing and then rent it to people at below market prices. What Labor will do and the Liberals will do is say, that's completely unrealistic. Oh, that's impossible. They'll pretend that, lots of countries around the world don't already do this. Now, the reason they do that is an attempt, I think, to crush people's hope about what politics can achieve. Because they know that young people and more broadly, people across this country collectively do have the potential to wield a lot of power. But as long as they feel demoralised and as long as they don't feel like they can change anything collectively, then Labor and Liberals win. And, the property developers and fossil fuel companies win. So I think the first thing to say is every time you feel that sense of hopelessness, know it is a feeling deliberately manufactured by political and partly media class who have no interest in a large collective movement making proper material demands on politics. Secondly, we've seen instances where large collective groups of people have made change recently. Look, the only reason I'm sitting here as an MP for the Greens is because over 1,000 people, largely young renters, went and knocked on a bunch of doors and stood up to the Labor Party and stood up to the Liberal Party, and we won. Now, that doesn't mean that change is going to happen overnight, but it does mean the only time it ever does happen is when people watching this video get out into the street, get organised with the Greens, get organised with the climate movement, with any student movement around Palestine, and make change. And I think just as a good reminder to say, oh, I'm feeling hopeless. Oh, I've been told this isn't possible. Well, the best way to get back at the politicians making you feel that way is to prove them wrong.
Speaking of people feeling like they have someone to stand up to, we asked some of our respondents how who actually did inspire them in politics. The Greens obviously mentioned a lot, and you were mentioned quite a few times. In fact, one comment said it was because he's got good morals and also kind of hot. So that's nice for you. But how do you, I guess, suggest that more young people and the more of like our generation are able to stand up to Labor? Because I know you were saying to be able to have that representation, you have to go in there, but there's so many barriers for young people to even get and to even run a campaign. We were out in Sydney Uni and we asked a few people, and someone said that they felt like they couldn't even afford to pay rent or the groceries, let alone run a campaign. So I guess what do you say to that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And it is true to say that if you're in financial stress, struggling to pay the rent, choosing between feeding your kids or making that next week's rent bill, it is hard to get involved in political organising. I think baby steps. Like, it might be that your best contribution is every second week you go door knocking. It might be that you help letterbox for a campaign. There are small practical things you can do that add up to a huge collective movement. And so I think getting involved in that way helps as well, because so much of politics these days is mediated via screens. Like, our engagement with politics often is feeling hopeless watching something on your phone. And that's partly because all of the collective institutions that used to give people a sense of collective power have largely collapsed. Like trade union membership, back in the 80s, 1 in 2 people were members of their trade union, 50%. Now it's about 12%. I imagine most of the people watching this video have never been involved in strike action, let alone being a member of their union. It's fair enough, actually, because a lot of those trade union organisations, certainly the leaderships of them, have given up on properly representing the working people they're meant to represent because they're too interested in helping out the Labor Party. Now, those are all reasonable things. So I don't think people should feel, oh, I'm not involved in a big campaign, I'm bad in some way. No, you're operating in a world where the vast majority of people feel hopeless, powerless, and don't have the opportunity to engage in a collective institution. So I think starting small. Like the first time we kicked off a campaign for the Greens when I got involved in 2015, I was managing a Greens Council campaign, and we held our first door knock, and 2 people showed up. And at the end of that campaign, we won the first ever Greens councillor. So it's about chipping away. It's about finding a small way to contribute and not feeling bad if you can only help 1 or 2 hours every 2 weeks. That's still a big deal.
Yeah. And speaking of, I guess, helping out people, you heavily criticised the Labor budget recently, saying that the government has lied to the public about social housing. Why do you think that is?
They came out, this is a few days before the budget, and this happens all the time. And I think it's, by the way, why a lot of people are switching off from politics. They came out and said, oh, we've announced $11 billion extra for social housing and homelessness. And the media dutifully reported that. And then you looked at the detail, and what they'd done is repackaged what has happened over the last 5 years and said they're going to do the same over the next 5 years and pretended like it was new. This was eventually pointed out. And what it became clear is what Labor was interested in was getting a headline that was positive without any material improvement in people's lives. Like, the crisis we're in right now is partly a result of chronic underinvestment in public housing. And what they just announced was locking in the same Liberal era chronic underinvestment of public housing. It amounts to, by the way, something less than $1.6 billion a year. Bumps up to about 1.8. That's what the Liberals spent on that every year. So, and apart from that, they've done nothing. Like this budget, for the 4 million renters who don't get Commonwealth rent assistance, they get nothing. Like, no, they could have coordinated a freeze and cap on rent increases. They could have phased out the tax handouts for property investors that mean every time a renter goes to try and buy a home, they get beaten out by a property investor because they can pay way more for the price of a house. And then for people on Commonwealth rent assistance, this shows, by the way, how little I think Labor get it. They were really proud because people on Commonwealth rent assistance get an extra $9 a week. Like $9 a week. There are people out there whose rents are going up by $100 a week. $9 a week is a slap in the face, and especially because people getting Commonwealth rent assistance largely are really low-income renters. And then you compare it to the tax handouts, so the stage 3 tax cuts. The Prime Minister, every week, as a result of their own tax handouts, will get $87 extra a week off on their tax, $87 in their pocket, and the low-income renter gets $9 a week. So you can see why I think it's a bit of a sick joke.
Why won't the government commit to a national rent freeze?
I think there's 2 reasons. One, property developers, the banks, and property investors wield enormous political power over the Labor Party. Like, their financial interests trump any other concern for the Labor Party. Certainly the banks, right? Like Anna Bligh, who is the former Labor Premier, well, she is the head of the banking lobby now. And they have a direct financial interest in allowing landlords to charge as much rent as they want, because that allows them to treat housing as a lucrative financial asset that makes banks, property developers, and property investors a lot of money. So if we were to freeze and cap rent increases, well, it would be harder for banks and property investors and developers to make a lot of money. So there's that. They do have an ideological opposition. They seem to think, they claim that freezing rent increases and then capping rents after that would somehow negatively affect the housing market. And what we say is, well, yes, it would negatively affect the profit margins of developers and investors, but it would help renters. And our argument is that we should have a housing system that treats housing as a home first, not as something to make a lot of money for a few people.
Yeah, and I think when you said that the budget being the Labor government boasting their budget was in a $9.6 billion surplus was a betrayal.
9.3 billion.
Oh, 9.3 billion. Sorry, my gosh. 9.3 billion surplus means that the government doesn't care about housing or the people. I guess why, like, how do you suggest that people feel any form of hope looking at that and thinking, okay, well, if they're so involved in the housing lobby and we can't even get rent freezes, we can't get affordable housing, but the budget is boasting about this surplus, how are we even meant to feel connected to that?
Yeah, you're not. I think the first thing to say is to make political change, you don't need to feel connected to the current political system. Like, I think there's this sense that, I'm a member of parliament, so I must really have some hope that the existing political system is going to change anything. I don't. What I do have a hope is that eventually there's going to be a big enough movement and a big enough political organisation that can fundamentally change the way politics works. And also understand that the only way that's going to happen is if a lot of people collectively get involved. What I often say is, the Labor and Liberal Party are very weak. They might be in government. Labor might be in government right now, but it is a mile wide and an inch thick, their control on politics, because they don't really have any connections into society. They don't have those large organisations they used to have. So where we ran the Griffith campaign, we were told that was a safe Labor seat, and we won it. No one gave us a chance. No one thought we would win, except for the people on the ground knocking on doors. And what that says is the only barrier to massive political change right now is our capacity to organise. Our capacity to organise thousands of people to go and knock on doors. Our capacity to go and reach people who also feel hopeless about politics, but instead of getting organised, have justifiably, by the way, decided to switch off. And it is our job as people who are somewhat interested in getting involved in building a mass movement to go and reach those people and say, you know what, you're right to feel disillusioned with politics. You're right to feel like you want to switch off. But guess what? Here's a movement that's fighting for free university, scrapping student debt, freezing rents, building enough public housing so everyone can have a good place to call home. We're going to tax billionaires to do it. That's our platform. That's what we want to do. But the only way we're going to do it is if you vote for it and get involved in it.
And speaking on movements and demonstrating, obviously there's a lot of protests happening around Gaza and Palestine. There were a lot around the climate. Do you suggest that people should, I guess, protest for rent freezes and affordable housing?
Yeah, protest is a really important part of any movement. And we held a renters rally at the front of Labor conference last year, and we think it helped build some pressure. Look, protests are crucial, and right now there's some fantastic protests protesting the genocide happening in Gaza right now. The school strike for climate, I thought, was a fantastic and really effective movement. The important thing to say, though, is protest alone, I don't think, is going to be the thing that changes stuff. There's a lot of people who've probably had the experience of going to a rally and be like, great, there's tens of thousands of people here, and then leaving that rally and thinking, well, what next? Why didn't anything change? And it can be a demoralizing experience, I think, if you're involved in a large protest movement and you don't feel like things have shifted. The defining political moment for a lot of people, probably a bit outside the demos for Junkee, was the Iraq War protests. These were the largest protests in human history in the world, and we still couldn't stop the Iraq War. And I don't think that means that protests are a useless tactic, but it means it's only part of it. Because what we do need to do after that protest, the question is what happens the day after? And what sort of collective organisations have we built? Do we have collective institutions that are capable of organising people in their everyday lives and in their workplaces that wields the sort of power that means when you come to an election, you're able to turn out hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of people to do that daily grind? And also then what happens the day after the election? Because even if we get a big change, what are the sort of organisations that we can turn out lots of people to stand up to the power of big corporations and those billionaires and the property council who wield so much power?
Switching gears a bit, there was an allocated $1 billion crisis accommodation for women fleeing domestic violence in the budget. Would you believe that $1 billion was the Greens securing that through half negotiations?
That's right.
Do you think that's even enough to protect women fleeing domestic violence?
It's a drop in the ocean. Like, look, on a principle basis, yeah, the Greens secured that $1 billion, but very open about saying that if we could have, we would have got much, much more. And the reality is that Labor just refused. Now, what we know is that last year alone, 36,000 people, the vast, vast, vast majority of whom were women, fleeing family and domestic violence, asked homelessness services, I'd like a long-term home. All 36,000 of them were told no, because there's not enough long-term housing out there. And that is frankly a disgrace in a wealthy country like this. And when you talk to domestic violence services and homelessness services, there's a lot of things we need to do, obviously, around tackling male violence. But one of the most practical things the government can do is make sure that every single time a woman flees a home or is thinking about fleeing, she knows she can get a good income above the poverty line and a good, nice home in a nice area where her and her kid can build a good life. And right now we don't have that. And what we know is that improving women's economic security, and even where a relationship's turning south, before it gets violent, where they think, I need to get out of here, they need to be able to leave straight away. They need to be able to think, I can end this relationship and I can move into a good home that the government has built where the rent is capped at a proportion of my income. I know I won't be in financial stress. And hey, maybe I can't work for a year, but that's okay because the single parent's pension is paid above the poverty line. Have that, and that is a really powerful, practical thing the government can do. And I think it's not unreasonable to say that there should be a target of 0 for the number of women who go to seek a long-term home and are turned away. There should not be a single woman that happens to in a country as wealthy as Australia.
I definitely think that echoes the sentiment a lot of people are feeling, especially our audience. And, you know, women's safety was one of the highest responses, as well as the housing crisis. And obviously they go hand in hand a lot of the time. What did you make of the Prime Minister's comments outside at the women's rally, basically, which kind of shocked most of the nation, I would say? But what did you kind of think as soon as you heard him say, and then made Sarah Williams cry?
I don't know. It was just such a good demonstration of the detachment between politics and people's lives. Like, I genuinely, part of it is I do not think that, including the Prime Minister, but I think in general, the Labor Party understand how much financial suffering and pain is going on at the moment. Maybe they do. I mean, it would be worse if they fully understood and still weren't doing anything about it. But for them to suggest, somehow get up and say, oh, governments need to do more, when he is in fact the Prime Minister and has the power to do more, I think is also a demonstration that there is a deliberate tactic to try and shrink the scope of what's possible in politics. What they want to communicate is, you might want more, but here I am, the Prime Minister, saying this is the best we can do right now. And what that does is, we're talking about hope before, right? It does shrink people's hope, because then they're sitting there and thinking, oh, well, the government can't do more than this. And people are, I think, with the right reaction, are very angry and upset about that, because the reality is they can. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what else I can say about that. It was a depressing thing to watch. And extremely disappointing.
Yeah, it kind of felt like a gut punch, I think, to a lot of people. And I suppose, as you were saying, the Labor government act as if they can only do so much. And there are a lot of criticisms as well to the basically saying, oh, well, there's more rent assistance for women living home, but that doesn't extend to women who are living in tents or in cars or don't have that ability.
Well, that's right. Also, all of that, exactly correct. And even if they get it, $9 extra a week. So the median rate in capital cities is $659 a week. And that's gone up by $56 a week over the last 12 months alone. So that $9 extra a week is a drop in the ocean. And again, I can stone cold guarantee statistics next year, there's still going to be tens of thousands of women being turned away from long-term accommodation because the government is not building enough public housing and the government is not freezing and capping rent increases.
I suppose with that, and people feeling really angry about that, on top of everything else that we have to feel angry about, we asked people how they felt between Albanese and Dutton for Prime Minister. Again, not great answers. Basically, everyone felt betrayed by Albanese and just scared of Dutton. But I suppose, what do you make of people who do feel let down by Albanese, even though they thought he would take action? And I suppose the need for more education, that there's more than just two parties, and that there is, minority parties and there's independents and things like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when this Labor government was elected, did have a bit of hope that things were going to that things were going to change, and justifiably feel deeply betrayed by a Labor government that, frankly, is not much different from the Morrison government before them on housing policy, on a lot of economic policy, on subsidies for fossil fuels. Like, there's very little to separate them. And I think you were talking about this, that I'm sure people had this sense that, finally, here's some change. And actually their lives get worse. Rents go up faster. Mortgages go up faster. House prices get even further out of reach. Student debt goes up. So that is a very demoralizing moment, I think, for people, and a sense of betrayal. So correct to feel that. But again, I mean, I think the other big shift that happened in that election was a huge surge in the Greens' representation in Parliament. And we saw this in our election in 2022. Labor's strategy, when we're about to win, is to go and tell people, a vote for the Greens, well, that will risk a Morrison or a Dutton prime ministership. A complete lie, like a complete fabrication. But the premise of it is don't hope for more than us. How dare you go out there and here's a party telling you, actually, we could tax billionaires to scrap student debt. Well, don't hope for that, because if you hope for that, you might actually just get done. Again, a lie. And they're going to run that in this election. Let me tell you, stone cold guarantee, any place where we look like we're about to win a seat, Labor will be out there telling people don't hope for more because that's dangerous. Now, no, that's a lie. And it's good to educate people and say, well, this is what we told people at the door. The Greens can actually win here. You could vote 1 Greens, number Labor 2, number every square after that. Best case scenario, you get a Greens MP elected. The very worst case scenario, it's a pretty bad scenario, you just get another Labor MP. And that's how our electoral system works. And our message to a lot of people was, positive change doesn't happen overnight. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that if you get a Greens MP, everything is going to change straight away. But what I can guarantee you is nothing is going to change if you just get another Labor or Liberal MP. And the first step to positive change is, at the very least, electing people who will fight for you and what you believe in.
You do give a lot of hope to a lot of, my friends, me even, who do rent, who are looking at this thinking, well, I'm never going to own a home, probably. I'm barely affording rent, groceries, everything else. So there is, other than we were talking about hope, but there is still a little bit there that I think if we can get more of our generation involved and active, which they already are, but just that little bit more, I think there's going to be a real upset at the next election, perhaps.
Big time. And I should just say, renters are a very powerful political force if they want to be. They're 1/3 of the country. That's huge. Like 1 in 3 people are renters. And if they want to and can get collectively organised, can wield an awesome amount of political power and lead a lot of people, even their parents and people who might not be renters, who are allied with them, could end up fundamentally transforming the politics in this country. So that sense of powerlessness you feel every time the landlord puts up the rent, or that sense of frustration and anger and hopeless rage as a landlord evicts you just for trying to enforce your own basic limited rights. That's a powerful force if we can harness it collectively, because you can go to your renter and say, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of the languages you speak, regardless of anything else, gender, sexuality, whatever, we share this in common. We share that material experience in common. And that is a powerful force that can build a united political movement that can give people the basics they need to live a good life.